this is the video portion of the show for you. And I think now when you see Keith for the first time, you're going to know why I always wanted to be like this guy and look like this guy and have the brain to this guy, because, in wrestling, this is really the complete package. Keith Elliott Greenberg. Hey, Keith.
Hey.
Look at him. Look at him. Look at him. Bro, you have to manage somebody or something.
Well, what can I tell you?
Now, Keith, listen, early on in this interview, you gave the quote that somebody made pertaining to you and working on their book. Can you repeat the quote?
Yes. I remember being a little taken aback when one of the people with whom I co-wrote a book complained that he was given a, quote, hippie from Greenwich Village as his co-author, which is a great insult to me since I grew up in Queens and Greenwich Village is in Manhattan.
Now, Keith, I don't know anything and I may be totally wrong, but I'm going to take a shot in the dark and I'm going to guess that comment came from Ric Flair.
Why would you guess that, Vince Russo?
Am I right?
Yes, but now
can I tell you why? That? You're going to get a kick out of this, Keith. Can I tell you why?
Yes.
Keith, I'm gonna take a couple of minutes here now because I want to tell you a story. Okay. Good. Keith, we were shooting the angle at WCW where, I had adopted David Flair and I had turned David against his father, Ric Flair. I got him wearing, I love New York shirts, the whole 9 yards, right? So then we went one step further and we brought Rick's younger son into the angle, who was like a wrestler, Reed Flair.
This a real wrestler.
He was a great wrestler, Reed, right?
Yes,
so then, Keith, the wife comes in. He was married to Beth at the time, right? So, bro, we're shooting this angle with his entire family. And, Keith, I'm marking out for this. And Keith, it means a lot to me that I'm able to do something, for David Flair. And now we got Reed Flair on TV. So it meant a lot to me as a fan that in a little way, I was able to give back to Ric Flair somehow, right? So Keith, we're at a television, right? We're in the middle of this story, and Rick comes up to me and says, "Vince, I got this great idea." And I said, "What is it, Rick?" And he goes to me, "You have to shave my head." Now, Keith, you got to understand, when you're around Ric Flair, you're still a mark for Ric Flair.
Of course.
I mean, Keith, I had 10 years in the business at the time, whatever it is, you're a mark around Ric Flair. I don't care. So, bro, my knee-jerk reaction is, Rick, are you kidding me? I almost said to him, Keith, you're Ric Flair. I'm not going to cut your hair. And no, Vince, it'll be great. It'll be great for the angle. It'll be great for David. You got to do it. You got to do it. And I'm like, Rick, are you sure? Absolutely, positively. I wouldn't have it any other way. It'll be great for the angle. So we go a couple of weeks later, and I think it was a tag match, actually, with Rick and Reed against me and David. Me and David wind up going over. We shave Ric Flair's head, per his suggestion. Well, Keith, a couple of years later, I'm at a Target or someplace like that, and I see your book for the first time. And, bro, every time I see Keith Elliott Greenberg's name, I pop. Yeah, I know Keith. Yeah, that's my buddy. So, bro, right then there in Target, I open up the book and I start reading through the book. And, bro, much to my amazement, there it is in black and white, Ric Flair taking a shot at me and burying me and saying that I was the one who came up with the lame brain idea of shaving his head. And, bro, I read this and I'm saying to myself, he honestly, truly had to forget how the conversation went down and that he was the one suggesting it, because bro, like, I didn't want to believe that Ric Flair was telling the story that way just because it was a better story. So as far as sitting down with him and writing a book, I can't even imagine how that experience was.
Well, you know, Ric Flair was a very busy guy at the time. And also, as you know, he has a lot going on in his head and he's going in a lot of different directions. So one of the greatest accomplishments I felt was being able to corral him to stop whatever he was doing and push the other people away who all wanted a piece of him to tell a heartfelt, honest story. And I felt that, you mentioned that Ric Flair may have sincerely forgotten the conversation. I believe that's true. I believe that in his mind, he believes that's how the conversation went down. And as much as he took shots at you and took shots at others and took some shots at me after the book was published, he was hardest on himself. And one of his greatest concerns, and I'm going to be serious now, was how his actions would affect his children. And I would hear him on the phone every day when I was in the car with him, with his son Reed. And he would ask about Reed's day. He knew what Reed had for lunch. He knew when Reed went to practice. He knew who Reed's friends were. And he would always tell Reed, "I love you." And I have to say, I learned a lot about fatherhood from that time I spent with Ric Flair. And I know he suffered a tragedy. I haven't seen him since the tragedy occurred. But as fortunate as Rick was to have Reed in his life, and Reed was a great kid, Reed was fortunate for that short time he was on this earth to have a father who loved him so fervently that for all of Ric Flair's faults, he always cared about his children first.
Keith, I have to ask you this question, and I'm not asking you this question, as it pertains to Rick. I'm asking you this question in general because you've written so many autobiographies of the greats. Now, Keith, here is where I really believe, your value in these books and penning these books comes in. Now, on the other side, Keith, you have just as much experience in the business as they do, of course, from an absolutely different perspective. But you know the business inside and out. You know the boys inside and out. You know how the boys are thinking inside and out. Whereas if it were just another author, they wouldn't know that. They wouldn't understand that. So, Keith, I want to ask you this question. While you're doing these series of books, I would imagine, Keith, there had to come some times or some situations where, as the writer, you may have felt like you were being worked, because let's face it, Keith, that's part of who the boys are. They're workers. That's what they do for a living. They work the people, and a lot of times that bleeds into their regular life. So, Keith, my question to you is, as you're interviewing these iconic symbols in the wrestling business, was there ever times where you felt like you may have been being worked and you were a step ahead of them? And if those times did arise, how did you handle that?
I wouldn't say I felt like I was being worked, because I feel that everything these guys told me, they believed with passion while they were telling me them. Whether their perceptions of history were accurate or not. There were times, though, when I felt that some of what they told me should be qualified and put in context. Oh, and there were also times when I didn't necessarily agree with them, but it's their story.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not my job if Ric Flair takes a shot at Vince Russo, and Vince Russo is my friend, my loyalty has to be to Ric Flair. I'm his co-author. I
Mm-hmm.
have to convey how Ric Flair feels about Vince Russo.
Mm-hmm.
And, as people may remember, I also was extremely fond of Bret Hitman Hart and Randy Savage and Mick Foley. Rick took shots at all of those guys. And, it was my job to convey what Rick felt in his heart. And sometimes that was a little bit of a struggle for me.
Keith, it's so funny that you talk about that and you bring that up. And I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn here because, Keith, as I'm out on the outside looking in now and I'm doing my own website and I'm doing my own podcast, right? And Keith, I book all the guests for my own podcast, right? So, Keith, it's like, now I sit back and I'm thinking, okay, I want to book this guy, I want to book that guy, and I want to book another guy, right? And, Keith, here I am, 53 years old. I'm out of the business now. I think it's fair to say, I'm going to be out of the business for good, working for another major company. But it's like, Keith, now I sit back and I have to really wonder and worry about and examine like who I have heat with. And like that's always a problem I've had in the business, Keith, between, myself and the performers and the boys. Because, Keith, with the position I was in, there was no way on the face of God's green earth that I was going to make everybody happy. There was no way in the world that every talent I ever worked with was ever always going to agree with me or my idea or my direction. Impossible. But Keith, like here's where the problem lies, and maybe you can get a little into the intellect and the thought of the boys, which I myself have a hard time dealing with. Now, Keith, when there would be a creative disagreement, or so and so didn't think I pushed them the right way, or I painted a picture of him the right way, or he didn't like a character I gave him. And Keith, I considered that like all business. That's all it was. It was all business. I know myself as a human being and as the man, Vince Russo, I never disrespected anybody and had the utmost respect for everybody I ever worked with. But I find out I find that a lot of my heat came from professional and came from business decisions and came from, not agreeing on what we were going to do tonight on Raw. And, any heat I have, a lot of that comes from that. And, it's like you said, Keith, I'm reading this book by Keith Greenberg. I'm reading these statements by Flair that I know are not true. In my mind immediately, I know, well, listen, Keith's writing this book, with Flair. Keith is writing what Flair is, telling him, was the fact. So there was no heat ever on my part that, oh, Keith is writing this and Keith is supposed to be my friend, because it was business and I understood it. Why do you think, bro, when it comes to heat in the business, that professional disagreement, can turn into years and years and years of heat and bitterness with some of the boys?
Because it's very personal. And, these men and women now have their public personas and their private personas intertwined. There's a reason why you very rarely see The Undertaker do an interview as Mark Calloway, because people perceive him as The Undertaker. And when somebody does something to undermine that public persona, it's taken very personally. And Vince, you were in a position to determine these people's fates, in essence. If you were pushing them to the moon, you were in their good graces. If you were asking them to do something that in their minds diminished them, even though you weren't diminishing them as individuals, they still look at you as somebody who hurt them. And this is where the whole work versus shoot thing gets very confused, because it's never black and white. It's gray. You can call professional wrestling fake, but it isn't fake. The guys in the ring break their bodies to entertain the fans, and they also care about the characters they're portraying. So the word fake, that's like doing a Shakespeare play. That's fake. This isn't fake. It's real. In some ways, it's more real than many other professions.
Man, Keith, that is some great insight. It really is. And I'm glad I asked you that question because, you know, your opinion when it comes to something like that means a lot to me. Yeah, bro, I remember I used to have, you know, Goldberg hated me. I mean, absolutely hated me because I felt they had done so much with Goldberg and his streak at WCW. You know, in my opinion, there was no place else to go in a babyface perspective. The only place to go with Goldberg was to turn him heel. And bro, I remember, you know, specifically and conversations, he hated me for that. And I remember
you also wrote something, and I don't know, as Vince Russo, you wrote something as kind of a heelish Vince Russo attacking Goldberg, saying he was a hypocrite. Do you remember that?
Well, yeah, but you know, Keith, but the whole
it was
thing
all
is
part of the business. It's not that you believed he was a hypocrite, but I could see how a Bill Goldberg could actually say, hey, some of these shots feel kind of personal.
yeah, and I understand that. And because, you know, Keith, here's the thing. When he used to get like that with me, like a lot of times, you know, like Keith, he was just coming off a movie where he was a bad guy in the movie. And I used to sit there with him and I used to say, Bill, you just played a heel in the movie. You know, what's the difference? And I couldn't wrap my head around it. But to him, he was Bill Goldberg and he was playing Bill Goldberg. And basically your breakdown and your explanation of it just made it a lot clearer to me.
Right. And it's interesting because now to say something in defense of you, and I don't want this to turn into a love fest, but, you know, if I type in your name online, I'm going to get a lot of really vile comments about Vince Russo. And I said this to you once. They don't know Vince Russo, the man. They know Vince Russo, the performer they saw in WCW. And they also know the creative angles Vince Russo conceived. But you know what? If I'm a lousy waiter, that doesn't mean I'm a lousy human being. But people won't judge me as a human being based on the fact that I'm a lousy waiter. If you came up with some angles that people don't like, they judge you, Vince Russo, as a person because of it.
No, absolutely. And that's an ongoing struggle to this day, but that's another story for another time because, Keith, I want to talk about, I didn't even know this existed to today. When Randy Savage passed away, probably, I think it's fair to say, you know, my all-time favorite, you know, hands down. And the reason why I can say that, because when I was younger, you know, it was much more easier to become infatuated, you know, by Jimmy and Johnny Valiant, you know, to be entertained by Lou Albano. You know, I was a kid, you know, George the Animal Steel. I was a kid. These people were larger than life. But listen, I was a father and I was still a fan of Macho Man Randy Savage. That's the difference. That's why I think it's fair for me to say that he was, you know, my all-time favorite. Now, I did have the pleasure of getting to interview him once. I made sure that happened when I was writing for the magazine. I went to, I think he was living at Treasure Island at the time. I spent some time with him, but Keith, I couldn't get that guard down. There was a flash here or there where maybe, Randy had a couple of beers and I was, able to crack the surface just a little. But man, the guy was probably the most guarded human being I've ever interviewed in my life. But man, when I read this story that you wrote for Bleacher Report after his passing, man, it really, really hit home to me, especially, the love of his family. I knew he loved his father, Angelo. I mean, I got that when I saw him around his father. But the story you tell about, his love of his mother and his father and Lanny, can you just, tell me a little bit about your experiences with Savage, before his tragic ending?
Well, I got to know Randy Savage fairly well. I met Randy when he first came into the WWF. Again, he always had his guard up. He would kick back and tell some stories, but when I would ask a little too much, like when I asked him about this confrontation he had with superstar Bill Dundee when he allegedly pistol whipped him, I remember Randy pausing and saying, there are a lot of versions of that story. Whereas most wrestlers, that's an opportunity for them to just rant for the next hour. A guy confronts you with a gun, you take it away from him and you pistol whip him. Wrestlers love to tell stories like that. Randy Savage, he did keep his guard up. But I saw a lot about Randy that I really enjoyed. I saw him be very kind to, the Make-A-Wish kids, as Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair were as well, as I've seen The Rock as well. And I remember we spoke about Ed Raschuti before. I remember Ed Raschuti's son was in high school, and I don't remember the issues Ed was having with his son, but he had told Randy about them. And Randy made a stop at Ed Raschuti's home and took his son to work out. And I think that ingratiated Ed's son with his father. And Randy was a busy guy and didn't have to do that. And it really filled me with admiration for Randy. And for every Randy Savage story you hear, that's a story I still remember. Just like for everything you say about Ric Flair, I remember what a great father Ric Flair was to his kids and probably still is to his children and his grandchildren.
Keith, I want to ask you this question because I want to see how you feel about this. This is, again, off the beaten path, but we kind of touched upon it. Keith, I got to tell you this. You and I both know firsthand, and you more than me. You are a veteran. You've been around a lot longer than me, Keith. But we all know, the trials and the tribulations of the wrestling business, the sacrifices, the loss, the broken families. We know all the stories. That's why, Keith, to me, when it comes to the WWE Hall of Fame, my theory is this: put everybody in. I don't care who they are. If that one individual can have that last moment in the spotlight and you can put them up on a pedestal for what they sacrificed in the business, put them all in there. Put the Brooklyn Brawler in there. Put Gilbert in there. The Iron Mike Sharp. Put them all in there. Give them their moment in the sun because they sacrificed so much. Now, Keith, I got to tell you, and I don't want to go into this. I mean, this isn't the story I want to go into, but I just wrote a story about this of like the 14 all-time greatest, snubs in the WWE Hall of Fame. And, my number one snub was obviously Randy Savage. Then ignorant me, I don't know where I've been all these years, but now, for the first time, I'm hearing rumors of why Savage isn't in the Hall of Fame. And I don't want to get to those rumors. This is what I want to get to. I think a lot of people, who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame are not in the Hall of Fame for personal issues. I think China is the perfect example. I think when you look at guys like, Rick Rude, who jumped ship in the middle of the night and went to WCW, I think the same. I would doubt that Lex Luger is ever going to find a home in the WWE Hall of Fame because of what he did. Medusa, perhaps the greatest woman wrestler, of all time in the WWE, next to the Fabulous Moolah, will not be in the Hall of Fame because, she dropped a belt in a garbage can because that's what her boss told her to do. I think there are some ways in wrestlers that they may have died, and the surroundings around their deaths that may keep them out of the Hall of Fame. I just want to know, Keith, being a historian and being around these guys and knowing what they go through, where do you sit on, a personal issue or a vendetta or a grudge not allowing certain individuals to make a final resting place in the WWE Hall of Fame?
I mean, I really don't know how you work around it because it's not, there are other wrestling halls of fame. There's one in Amsterdam, New York, which I haven't visited. I hear it's a very nice building, and that it's very respectful to the talent who are represented there. I mean, WWE are the caretakers of history, rightly or wrongly, at least in the United States. Those are the folks who the winners write the history. So, I mean, I don't know how you can really work around that. Now, I am not working for the company as of now. It does seem that Vince McMahon has made an effort to make peace with people who were his mortal enemies. Bruno's in the Hall of Fame and the Ultimate Warrior's in the Hall of Fame. So I would imagine that, Vince McMahon better than I do, but I imagine he's looked himself in the mirror and asked himself this very same question.
Yeah. Well, Keith, you just brought it up, and this wasn't on my list. What are your thoughts and your insights into Warrior and the time that you got to spend around him?
I didn't get to know Warrior very well. I didn't have any negative experiences with Warrior. He kept to himself, and he wasn't a guy who would see me, smile, call me over, and start feeding me gossip. There were many other guys who did.
He might have thought you were a hippie from Greenwich Village.
He may have, and given some of his comments in his post wrestling life, that's very possible. Yeah. But I know that there was the Hulk Hogan era, and I remember it very clearly. Hulk Hogan loses the championship, and then to the Ultimate Warrior. The Ultimate Warrior is anointed. And then the next big pay-per-view was SummerSlam. And at the time, even though I'm writing for WWE, I'm still living in my neighborhood where I grew up, and I'm still hanging out with my friends who I grew up watching wrestling with. And we gather in Marissa Scalisi's basement to watch. I mean, we're adults, but Marissa Scalisi's living in a basement apartment. And we gather to watch that pay-per-view, and it's Rick Rude against the Ultimate Warrior at SummerSlam. And then I think the second main event is Hulk Hogan against Earthquake John Tenta. And something was missing. I remember looking at these other people who I grew up with, and I could just feel these people weren't going to be renting the Survivor Series in November. That they'd been renting every pay-per-view, and the baton had been passed. And with all due respect to the late Warrior, it may have been passed to the wrong guy.
Well, Keith, let me ask you this, and this is going to wrap up. This is the last question I'm going to ask you with the wrestling portion because I really want to get into this Lennon book. Keith, having been around, forever, and seeing it all in the wrestling business, starting with your grandparents, passing it down to you. What are your views and opinions of today's product? And what do you think needs to be changed in order to bring the wrestling to the heights, that you and I have seen over the years?
You know, I have a different. You mentioned your children before and their ages. My youngest child is 10 years old, and she's a girl, and she's a very big wrestling, a very big WWE fan. She and I, we've been to indie shows together. We went to a TNA show together, but she's a big WWE fan. And so some of the things that as an old school fan disturb me because, hey, they're gearing it too much for the kids. I see her popping. We go to a show and she chants for the Usos. She chants, let's go Cena, when the older fans are chanting Cena sucks. And it makes me feel, all right, stuff is working that I wouldn't normally give them credit for. But ultimately, what does it take? It takes that right personality to bring it into the next era. I mean, Daniel Bryan was picking up a lot of followers until he got injured. But who is going to be that next guy that's going to transcend professional wrestling? Is he on the roster already? I don't know, but that's really what it's going to take. That along with creative storytelling. So Vince Russo's not going to come back and anoint that guy, but there may be some kid growing up, out on Long Island now who's like a Vince Russo who 10 years from now will be creating those storylines.
Yeah. Okay, Keith, I want to turn to, John Lennon. Keith, first of all, I want to, Keith has written, Keith, give me the exact number. I know it's over 30. Have you
It's
lost
over.
track?
I don't even know the amount because some of the books I've written were children's books, nonfiction children's books, and some of them I've written, taken a lot of time on. Some of them I've turned over very quickly. So it's in excess of 30 books.
Do you ever stop writing, Keith? Do you ever take a break, or is it one project right after the next?
Well, you talk about how, the wrestlers' marriages are tested and, they're not home. I'm home a lot, but I'm also writing a lot. And that certainly it does challenge family life sometimes.
Do you ever get tired of it, Keith? Do you just wake up some days and not want to write? Or do you have such a busy schedule that, you don't even have that privilege?
Well, I can't afford not to write since I support my family by writing. I just finished a book that will be out in September 2015 on the death of James Dean. It's for the same publisher that I did the John Lennon book on. And I didn't know a lot about James Dean going into it. And there would be times when I would wake up and I would kind of feel a little panic. And I'd think, how am I going to tell this story? I'm not qualified to do this. How am I going to fill all these pages? Are the people going to care? He only made 3 movies. Where's this all going to come from? There's that. And then I'd have to say, hey, I'm a professional. I've been doing this a long time, and I'm going to tell this story as well as anyone can do it because that's why I've been assigned to write this book.
That's a phenomenal attitude. Well, right now I want to talk about this book. I'm going to hold it up to my little camera here. It's December 8th, 1980, the day John Lennon died. This was written by Keith Elliott Greenberg. And Keith, let me first ask you, how did this book come about?
Well, much like professional wrestling, I was also a big Beatles fan, as you were too. And I remember I was 21 years old when John Lennon died. And I remember I went to Strawberry Fields for the moment of silence. I was very caught up in that. And Mike Edison, who was the editor of this book, who's also a huge wrestling fan. In fact, he wrote for, what was it, Wrestling's Main Event, I think in his early days. Mm-hmm. That was one of his jobs. We discussed the possibility of doing a book about John Lennon's death and its impact. And I said, you know what? When John Lennon died, I saved a bunch of articles about this. I didn't know I was ever going to write a John Lennon book, but I felt the need to preserve these articles. And I had a special edition of the now defunct Soho News that I'd saved. So I go into my filing cabinets and I'm looking for it. I'm looking for it. I'm looking for it. I can't find it. So I go to the library. I'm researching. I'm looking, through old newspapers, and I'm thinking, where did that special edition go? Like, after the John Lennon book came out, I opened up some box and it was in there with my Son of Sam stuff that I also saved. So that's how much of a mark I am for, murderous, news stories.
Here's the one thing about John Lennon. I mean, there's so many things, but here's the one fascinating thing to me that, like, this fact is totally unbelievable to me. And I don't think a lot of people understand it when you look at the life of this man. When you sit down and think about it, people don't realize the Beatles were broken up when John Lennon was 30 years old. And when he was 40, he was dead.
Right.
I mean, to me, the life up until the day he died is just unbelievable when you look at how young John Lennon was. And, Keith, if you had to answer one question, like, in your opinion, having done the research and having studied it, what was it that made John Lennon so polarizing to people?
I think that John Lennon was a product of the way he was raised. And look, his father and mother squabbled in the street over who was going to take him. And at first, John's father went off to Australia. And at first, John began to walk with his father. He was going to get on a ship with his father, leave Liverpool, go to Australia, maybe never see his mother again. And there's John's mother standing there on the street as John's walking off with his father. And she's like, all right, screw you guys. And as she's doing that, John suddenly runs back to her. Now, think about how that would mess with your mind, that you're about to cut one parent off. And then he's raised by a woman who certainly nurtures his creativity, but she's a total outsider. His Aunt Mimi takes him into her home because the family doesn't even look at his mother as a fit mother. And so he looks at everything from outside the mainstream. And I think probably as much as he scorned people who he regarded as squares, maybe he envied them a little bit too. And that, I think, fed that polarizing nature of his personality.
Keith, I have to ask you this question. With that being said, okay, and again, I've read about John Lennon, so much through the years, and I've watched every documentary and everything possible. But when you talk about that John Lennon, and we look at the John Lennon older in life, when the Beatles were coming up in Germany, and, when they were coming up in Liverpool, and they were making a name for themselves, Keith, I can't see John Lennon as a guy, that was chasing the fame and the fortune and the money. Was John Lennon the type of guy, because of that relationship, like you said, with his mother, and then his father left, was he just the guy, looking for acceptance, and all the fame and the fortune and the riches weren't important?
I think John Lennon was just playing music. Look, John Lennon wanted to make it. Anybody who's working as a professional musician wants to cut a record deal. Nobody could have been emotionally prepared for what happened to the Beatles. They were completely ill-equipped for it. No, at 55 years old, I wouldn't be equipped for that kind of thing. They were kids. If you recall, George Harrison was sent home from the early gigs in Germany because he was 17 years old. He wasn't even old enough to play in these clubs. So imagine being 21, 22 years old and you're one of the Beatles. Keith Richards' book, he talks a little bit about that. He says, I think he phrases it, one day you're listening to Muddy Waters records and, a week later, there you are on stage with Muddy Waters. It just happens so fast.
Well, do you think so much so soon, really, what was that what led to the premature demise of the band?
I mean, I think it put an enormous amount of pressure on them. I mean, here are these guys, they play a concert, they get mobbed. I mean, they had to be taken off the field in Cleveland with an armored car to protect them from their own fans. We talk about wrestling and, guys having to fight their way out of the arenas. I mean, this is that times a million. And there's stories like that the Beatles would be sitting in the bathroom at their hotel because everyone else is in their suite. They've been invaded by the press and hangers on. That's no way to live. And, that puts an enormous amount of strain on you.
Now, Keith, later on in life, we know that, Lennon, embraced New York City. I mean, it's, documented a million times over. Now, being a native New Yorker and still being there for 55 years, what was the stranglehold and the appeal that New York City seemed to have on John Lennon after all those years?
The appeal that New York had for John Lennon is in some ways the appeal that it has to me, which is why I regarded John Lennon as a true New Yorker. And I don't always regard blow-ins as true New Yorkers because I think they're here while everything's good. But once something gets bad after 9/11, all those people who ran away, let them go. They were never New Yorkers to begin with. I think John Lennon enjoyed that he could walk around the street, that he knew the doorman in his neighborhood, that he could go into the Greek diner and the guy would put his picture up and still treat him pretty decently if he came in with his kid. That, he knew some of the cops who would be stationed outside the Dakota. And he could live as close to the life of a human being, as close as he ever could to a civilian. This was the city where he could live that way.
Now,
and look, his wife stayed there. His wife saw her husband murdered in front of her eyes, in front of her home, and she's still there.
Now, Keith, there are two things, about John, that kind of split me. And I want to talk to you about these two things because I know you did massive, research. The book is December 8th, 1980, the day John Lennon died. And it's not just about that day. I know you did the extensive research. Two things, Keith. One is a positive for me and one is a negative. The more and more I read about John, Keith, I never, as a Beatles fan, I never put the heat on Yoko Ono for breaking up the Beatles for one apparent reason. Everything I read about John and I read about Yoko and I read about their relationship, John Lennon was madly in love with this woman. And I think when you read about him and you have an understanding of that and the love he really truly had for Yoko, the thought of her breaking up the Beatles and her taking him away from the Beatles, to me is absolutely absurd. What can you tell us about that relationship, especially leading up to the last days?
I mean, Yoko Ono was an artist, and John Lennon was an artist. He had the soul of an artist. Not only was he writing music, he was drawing. He was at an art gallery when he met her. She spoke to his artistic soul. And so it's not like she swooped in there and came up with this, secretive agenda. That's who he wanted to be with. And they were creating music together. In fact, by the end, the Beatles were essentially a backup band for most of the individual members. George Harrison was off on his Eastern meditation trip. He'd write these songs, and then the other Beatles would play them. Paul McCartney was writing the stuff that, the type of music you'd later hear in Wings, and then the Beatles would play them. They were highly creative people going in separate directions and trying to form adult lives. John chose to have it with Yoko. Paul, was forming it with Linda. And, you can't really blame Yoko for that. I think if you ran to Paul McCartney in this day and age, he wouldn't blame Yoko for that.
This Keith is where like I step into a little muddy water, when it comes to John Lennon, and I hope you can give me some insight into this and maybe some things I don't know about. Now, we all know towards the end of his life, Keith, we know John's life, changed dramatically, with the birth of his son Sean. With Sean, John became a house husband, where he was taking care of the baby, around the clock. Now, you would have to think, I would have to think, that had a lot to do with maybe some of the guilt that John felt towards his relationship with his older son,
Absolutely.
Julian. They were never close. There's a history there. Now Sean is born, the love child of him and Yoko. John's not going to make the same mistake again. His world, becomes Sean Lennon. But my question to you is this, Keith. I know that there was more of a connection and more communication with Julian, towards the end of his life. But, as he built his life around Sean, was that not the opportunity to really go back to Julian and start over? And if he didn't, what do you think might have been going through his mind at that time?
I mean, I actually think he would have done that. I believe there were plans for Julian to come out to New York and spend some time with John and Yoko and Sean. I mean, he was, I don't think it's a secret that John Lennon wasn't going to make the same mistakes again. When Julian was born, the Beatles it was 63. The Beatles hadn't even come to the US yet. Things were happening. He came in, he saw Julian, and then I think he went on vacation with Brian Epstein the next day because, he was hustling. The Beatles were his priority. Now, John was a mature man. He was a 35-year-old man when Sean was born. He wasn't going to make those mistakes, and I'm sure he wanted to repair the relationship with his older son. Interestingly, Paul McCartney was very supportive of Julian when Julian became a rock star, and I think that, John would have been there for his older son as well.
Now, Keith, that day, December 8th, 1980, the day John Lennon died, the story's been documented. You did extensive research, the blow by blow of that day and, everything that happened in John's life. As you were doing this research, Keith, what was the one thing, above all, that just stayed with you, about this tragic day in history that, till the end of time, will weigh heavy on the heart, of every Beatle fan, across the country? What details of that day just really seemed to stay with you as you did the research for this book?
Well, the details of that day, that was the day where he took that iconic photo where he's naked and his body's wrapped around Yoko, and hours later he's dead. So here he is, a man who seems to be in the prime of his life, and then life is taken away so quickly, which shows how fragile life is. Now, from a selfish point of view as a Beatles fan, you think about what if John Lennon didn't die? And there had been conversations with him and Paul McCartney about possibly playing Central Park together. Now, George and John were not on the best of terms at the time, but you would think that eventually they'd get over it. Not for the money, but hey, they're bonded. They're part of a family. Just we were talking about the wrestlers, how that's part of a family, a part of the same fraternity. I think they would have played together again. They might have made music again, not exclusively, but that chance went away. And I think everyone had this dream that we would see the Beatles play together again, and then it was an impossibility.
What is the one thing, having done so much research and having studied the man, what is the one thing, Keith, as a Beatle fan, as a historian, as the author of December 8th, 1980, the day John Lennon died, what was the one final thing you really took away, from John Lennon as a human being?
To follow your own heart. And that would even include breaking up the Beatles. John Lennon did as he wanted to do. By and large, he became an activist when pop singers were just supposed to be that, pop singers. I mean, Tony Bennett was considered radical for supporting Dr. Martin Luther King. By and large, pop singers didn't do stuff like that. He was outspoken. If something was kooky, he did it anyway. He was image conscious, but he didn't really care about the backlash. And he was bigger than anybody else. And whether you're Howard Stern or Vince Russo or Nature Boy Ric Flair, sometimes you have to do what your heart tells you to do. And that's why people remember all those names.
Well, Keith, I want to show this book again because it is phenomenal. You can get it on Amazon. It's December 8th, 1980, the day John Lennon died. Who's the publisher of the book, Keith?
The publisher it's Backbeat Books, which is a division of Hal Leonard Publishing. They're also publishing my next book about James Dean.
Yeah, Keith, what are you doing next? What's next for Keith? After this interview, now a lot of people in the wrestling world, they saw the name a lot. Now they can put a face to it. So, Keith, tell me, what's next? People want to follow your career going forward. Where can they find you?
Well, that book is coming out. There's some other book projects that I'm in the midst of researching or discussing. I've been writing periodically for Bleacher Report about the sport of kings. And I work full-time at NBC, and I do hour-long shows for a number of clients that NBC markets to. I've done quite a bit for MSNBC, those hour-long crime shows you see on there. I have a project that I'm doing with a woman named Aphrodite Jones for Discovery ID. So I've been doing a lot of television production as well.
Well, Keith, it has been an honor not to only have you on this show. It has been an honor to know you for the last 20 years. You are by far the most intelligent, well-spoken, good-looking human being that I know. You taught me a lot about wrestling. Like I said, I mean, the day I saw this book on the newsstand, December 8, 1980, the day John Lennon died, I hadn't spoken to you in a while. When I saw this book and I saw that you had written it, I was so, proud to be able to call, Keith Greenberg my friend. And again, Keith, I want to thank you, first of all, for all the years of friendship, for teaching me what you did about the wrestling business, but also for being on this show and sharing your insights with us on not only professional wrestling, but, John Lennon and his last days here.
Good, man. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I know sometimes years go by when we don't speak, but as I always tell people when they want to talk about Vince Russo, the character they know on TV, I sometimes feel sorry for them because they don't know Vince Russo as a friend.
Well, I really, really appreciate that, Keith. And Keith, I'm going to have you on again because I know, you've got a whole other true crime history, working for Geraldo and some extraordinary, books you wrote as far as crime is concerned. We didn't even have the time to touch upon. I'm going to bring you on again where we could talk about just that if you'll give me the honor of doing the show again.
Of course I will, Vince.